In the White Feather, the morning frost clung to the abandoned factory windows as Senior Lieutenant Alexei White Feather Volkov adjusted the scope on his SV-98 sniper rifle. His grandmother's voice echoed in his memory as he controlled his breathing, just as she had taught him during those quiet afternoons in her Rostov kitchen. "Calm breath, steady heart," she would whisper while kneading bread. He had named his rifle after her advice, Calm Breath. Though 47 confirmed kills over 18 months of urban warfare in eastern Ukraine had made breathing anything but calm. But this December morning in 2014, in the contested industrial zone outside Donetsk, White Feather wasn't hunting enemy combatants. Through his scope, he watched helplessly as 8 reconnaissance scouts from his own unit huddled in a concrete drainage culvert, trapped like mice in a slowly tightening trap. The scouts had been conducting routine intelligence gathering when separatist forces shifted their patrol patterns, cutting off all escape routes. Radio intercepts crackled through his earpiece. The enemy knew exactly where his men were hiding and planned to flush them out systematically with grenades and automatic weapons fire. White Feather studied the killing ground through his scope. 400 meters of open terrain stretched between the culvert and safety, dotted with rusted machinery and concrete barriers that favored the defenders. 40 enemy positions formed an iron noose around his trapped comrades. 8 men against 40 entrenched positions. Captain Dmitry Kozlov's voice carried the cold pragmatism of an officer who had made such calculations before. "We cannot risk the entire company for scouts who ventured too far forward." They knew the risks. The military doctrine was clear. Do not compound losses with futile rescue attempts. White Feather had memorized those same principles at the academy, back when warfare seemed like mathematics, rather than watching friends prepare to die. Corporal Victor, his spotter, whispered urgently beside him. "The separatists are moving assault teams into position, maybe 15 minutes before they rush the drainage pipe." Through their radio, White Feather could hear the trapped scouts checking ammunition and saying quiet goodbyes. Sergeant Petrov's voice broke slightly as he mentioned his daughter's name. Private Kozlenko hummed a fragment of an old folk song their unit had adopted as an unofficial anthem. White Feather's finger traced the trigger guard of Calm Breath, feeling the familiar grooves worn smooth by countless missions. In his breast pocket, a single white feather waited, his calling card left at every shooting position. 3 campaigns had made that feather a psychological weapon as effective as his rifle. Enemy fighters had learned to fear the White Feather's signature. But signatures meant nothing when your own people were dying. That's when he noticed something unusual through his scope. The enemy had positioned their command post in the 2nd floor of a partially collapsed apartment building, approximately 600 meters from his position. More importantly, they had strung communication cables between their scattered positions, thin black lines barely visible against the snow, connecting their coordinated assault like a spider's web of death. White Feather felt his grandmother's calm breath technique steadying his heartbeat as an impossible idea formed in his mind. Calm Breath was loaded with an experimental ammunition mix that day, standard 7.62 54mm rounds, and several tungsten core penetrators designed for equipment destruction. He had been skeptical of the new ammunition. Heavier, affecting trajectory calculations, unnecessarily complex. But those tungsten rounds could sever cables and destroy electronic equipment at distance. What happened in the next 23 minutes would quietly change everything White Feather believed about warfare, mercy, and the weight of impossible choices. If stories like this make you question what you'd do in someone else's boots, tell us in the comments how you imagine you'd react in this situation, and stay with us for the next chapters. How do you choose between military doctrine and the voices of dying friends? White Feather made a calculation that violated every principle of sniper employment he had been taught at the Ryazan Higher Airborne Command School. Instead of targeting enemy personnel, he would systematically destroy their communication network, creating confusion that might allow the scouts to escape in the chaos. His first shot severed the main communication cable just outside the command post window. The tungsten penetrator cut through the line like a blade through silk, sparking briefly as it embedded in the concrete beyond. 3 seconds later, his second round cut the primary relay line to the Eastern assault team. Through his scope, Whitefeather watched enemy commanders frantically trying to re-establish contact with their units. The coordinated assault began degenerating into confusion as individual teams lost connection with headquarters. Some units held position, waiting for orders that would never come. Others moved prematurely, breaking their concealment. "What are you doing?" Victor hissed, watching muzzle flashes erupt from multiple enemy positions as separatist fighters began searching for the sniper. "You're supposed to target personnel, not cables." "Shut up and spot," Whitefeather replied, his grandmother's breathing technique keeping his hands steady as rounds cracked overhead and sparked off the factory's steel framework. Victor urged retreat, but Whitefeather remained focused on his scope, methodically tracking cable lines and communication equipment. His fourth shot destroyed a radio antenna. His fifth severed another cable section, completely isolating the Western assault team. In the contested industrial zone outside Donetsk, winter had turned the abandoned factories into a maze of frozen metal and shattered concrete. Whitefeather had learned to read this terrain like a book over 18 months of urban warfare, noting how shadows fell, where cover offered protection, how sound echoed off broken walls. The breakthrough came with his 7th shot. Whitefeather had noticed one enemy position using a field telephone connected by wire to the command post. The tungsten round not only cut the telephone line, but struck a fuel container positioned nearby, creating a small explosion that convinced nearby fighters they were under artillery bombardment. Through his earpiece, he heard the trapped scouts recognizing their opportunity. Sergeant Petrov's voice carried new hope. "Smoke grenades now! They're shooting at shadows! We can move!" The 8 men began their desperate sprint from the drainage culvert toward a series of concrete barriers that would provide concealment for withdrawal. Enemy fire was sporadic and uncoordinated, with different units shooting at ghosts while their commanders struggled to regain control. Whitefeather provided precision overwatch, using his remaining tungsten rounds to destroy equipment and create diversions rather than targeting personnel directly. When one enemy machine gun team threatened to pin down the escaping scouts, he put a round through their weapon's optical sight, forcing them to relocate and losing precious seconds. From his position in the factory ruins, Whitefeather could see the broader tactical picture that eluded the separated enemy units. The separatist forces had trained for coordinated assaults, not fragmented communication failures. Without their carefully planned timing, their numerical advantage became a liability as confused units fired at each other's positions. Victor watched in amazement as the impossible rescue unfolded. "How did you know that would work?" Whitefeather didn't answer immediately, focusing instead on protecting his escaping comrades. In his mind, he could hear his grandmother's voice during those long afternoons in her kitchen, teaching him that sometimes the hardest problems required the gentlest solutions. She had been a communications technician during the Great Patriotic War, understanding better than most generals how fragile the threads were that held armies together. 23 minutes after his first shot, all 8 scouts reached friendly lines, exhausted but alive. The enemy assault collapsed entirely as their isolated units withdrew independently, unable to coordinate or communicate effectively. In the aftermath, Whitefeather carefully placed a single white feather at his shooting position before withdrawing with Victor through the factory ruins. But this time, the calling card felt different in his hands, less like a threat, more like a prayer of gratitude. Captain Kozlov's after-action report struggled to explain how a single sniper had neutralized a superior enemy force without inflicting significant casualties. The unconventional ammunition and communication-focused targeting had created results that didn't fit standard tactical models taught at Russian military academies. "Your methodology was unorthodox," the captain said during the debriefing, reviewing the battlefield intelligence with obvious confusion. "Doctrine clearly states that sniper teams engage high-value personnel targets, not infrastructure." White Feather sat quietly in the makeshift command post, watching Kozlov struggle with reports that defied conventional wisdom. Outside, the December wind howled through the ruins of what had been Donetsk's industrial heart before the conflict transformed factories into fortress positions. "The tungsten rounds worked better than expected," White Feather offered, though his mind kept returning to Sergeant Petrov's broken voice, saying his daughter's name in what he thought were his final moments. The rescued scouts had been debriefed separately, their accounts confirming the timeline, but raising questions about tactical innovation versus insubordination. Military regulations were clear about following established protocols, even when those protocols meant accepting acceptable losses. 3 days later, a letter arrived from White Feather's grandmother in Rostov. Her familiar handwriting carried news from home, winter preparations, neighborhood gossip, and gentle concerns about her grandson's well-being. She mentioned the bread she was baking for Christmas, using the same recipe she had taught him to make with calm breath and steady hands. But the letter also carried darker news. His younger brother Pavel had been drafted and assigned to an artillery unit. His sister Katya was working double shifts at the medical clinic, treating casualties from various training exercises that weren't officially acknowledged as combat operations. "The television shows many maps with arrows," his grandmother wrote, "but they never show the faces of the boys those arrows represent. Remember what I taught you about breathing, dear one. Sometimes the hardest thing is knowing when to shoot and when to wait." That evening, White Feather cleaned calm breath methodically, reflecting on the tungsten ammunition that had seemed like unnecessary complexity until it became the key to saving 8 lives. The experimental rounds had been developed by engineers who understood that modern warfare often involved more than killing. Sometimes it required breaking the invisible threads that held enemy coordination together. Victor found him in their shared quarters, studying technical manuals about communication disruption tactics. "You realize what you did out there could become doctrine, or could get me court-martialed for deviation from established procedures," White Feather replied, thinking about the fine line between innovation and insubordination. News from the broader conflict filtered through official channels and unofficial rumors. The situation in eastern Ukraine remained fluid, with territory changing hands based on factors that rarely appeared in intelligence reports: fuel shortages, communication failures, civilian evacuations that complicated military movements. White Feather's unusual rescue had begun attracting attention from tactical specialists interested in unconventional applications of sniper capabilities. Several requests had arrived for detailed reports on equipment modification and targeting methodology. But in quiet moments, White Feather found himself thinking less about tactical innovations and more about the sound of Sergeant Petrov's voice when he realized his daughter would not lose her father that day. Some victories couldn't be measured in body counts or territorial control. The White Feather from his latest position remained in his breast pocket, waiting for the next mission. But increasingly, he wondered what his grandmother would think of her bread-making lessons being applied to warfare, and whether calm breath could carry him through choices that standard doctrine couldn't anticipate. "Do you think you'd cling to what you were taught back home, or to what your own eyes see in a place like this? Comment which side you'd lean toward, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. What price do soldiers pay when they succeed by breaking the rules that define them? 2 weeks after the rescue, White Feather received orders for a new assignment. The experimental tungsten ammunition had been rushed into production, and communication disruption tactics were being tested by other sniper units across the Donetsk region. His unconventional success had become a case study, though not everyone viewed innovation favorably. Major Sokolov, the new tactical advisor, arrived with a briefcase full of theoretical frameworks and skeptical questions. "Your results are impressive, Volkov, but warfare is built on predictable doctrine for good reasons. Soldiers need to know what their comrades will do in crisis situations." The major had never served in urban combat. His knowledge derived from military academies and strategic planning sessions, far from the industrial ruins where real battles were fought. He studied Whitefeather's after-action reports like mathematical equations, searching for patterns that could be systematized and taught. "Communication disruption shows promise," Sokolov continued, "but it requires exceptional marksmanship and intimate knowledge of enemy equipment. These techniques cannot be reliably replicated by average soldiers." Whitefeather listened politely while cleaning his rifle, remembering his grandmother's patience with difficult students during her years teaching at the village school. She had always said that some lessons could only be learned through experience, not instruction. Meanwhile, the 8 rescued scouts had been reassigned to different units, their rescue becoming a classified success that couldn't be publicly acknowledged. Sergeant Petrov had managed to send a brief message before transfer. His daughter was learning to bake bread using her great-grandmother's recipe, the same techniques Whitefeather's grandmother had taught him about patience and steady hands. The irony wasn't lost on him. His most successful mission had involved not killing in a war where success was typically measured in enemy casualties. The tungsten rounds that saved 8 lives had been developed for destroying equipment, not preserving it. Victor remained his spotter, though their partnership had grown complicated by attention from higher command. "They want to turn you into a symbol," he warned during equipment maintenance. "The sniper who thinks outside the box, who saves lives through technical innovation." "I just did what seemed possible at the moment," Whitefeather replied, though he understood Victor's concern. Military bureaucracy had a tendency to transform individual decisions into institutional doctrine, often losing essential context in the process. Dr. Elena Marchenko, a military psychologist, arrived to conduct interviews about decision-making under pressure. She was particularly interested in how Whitefeather had overcome ingrained training to attempt an unconventional solution. "Your psychological profile indicates strong adherence to protocol," she noted during their session. "Yet you chose to violate explicit doctrine. What factors influenced that decision?" Whitefeather thought about his grandmother's bread-making lessons, how she had taught him that recipes were guidelines, not absolute laws. Sometimes the flour required more water, or the yeast needed additional time, or the oven temperature had to be adjusted for altitude and humidity. "The situation demanded adaptation," he said finally. "Doctrine assumes certain conditions, but those conditions don't always exist in reality." Dr. Marchenko made notes about adaptive thinking and situational flexibility, terms that sounded clinical when applied to watching friends prepare to die. She was building psychological profiles for future sniper selection, identifying traits that might predict innovative thinking under pressure. But Whitefeather knew that innovation couldn't be taught or selected for. It emerged from the intersection of training, desperation, and the particular moment when doctrine proved inadequate. His grandmother had understood that bread-making, like warfare, required responding to conditions that couldn't be anticipated in advance. That evening, he wrote a letter home, describing the winter landscape around Donetsk and carefully avoiding details that military censors would redact. He mentioned the tungsten ammunition experiments and his hope that new techniques might save lives, though he couldn't explain whose lives or under what circumstances. The central secret revealed itself 3 weeks later, hidden in a classified report that Whitefeather wasn't supposed to see. Dr. Marchenko had left her research notes open on the command post table during a briefing interruption, and Victor's curious glance had caught a paragraph that changed everything they thought they understood about their mission. The tungsten ammunition hadn't been developed for equipment destruction at all. According to Marchenko's psychological study, the experimental rounds were designed specifically to test whether snipers could adapt to non-lethal objectives under extreme pressure. Whitefeather's entire unit had been unknowingly participating in a behavioral experiment. They wanted to see if elite marksmen could overcome killing instincts when necessary, Victor whispered, showing Whitefeather the relevant passage. Your rescue wasn't tactical innovation, it was data collection. The implications crashed over Whitefeather like cold water. His grandmother's breathing techniques, the calm precision that had saved 8 lives, had been manipulated by researchers studying psychological flexibility in combat situations. The moment he thought demonstrated independent thinking had actually confirmed someone else's hypothesis, but the secret ran deeper. Dr. Marchenko's notes revealed that similar experiments were being conducted across multiple theaters, testing various scenarios where traditional doctrine might prove counterproductive. The military was quietly exploring whether highly trained soldiers could be conditioned to think beyond established parameters while maintaining operational effectiveness. Whitefeather's success had become Template 7A in a broader study of adaptive combat psychology. His decision to target communication infrastructure instead of personnel had validated theoretical models about creative problem-solving under stress. The 8 saved lives were statistical proof that doctrine could be selectively violated without systemic breakdown. "Does it matter?" Victor asked, watching his partner process the revelation. "Petrov still goes home to his daughter. The other 7 are still alive. Your methods still worked." But it mattered to Whitefeather in ways he couldn't immediately articulate. His grandmother had taught him that bread making required authentic attention to flour, water, and yeast, not performance for observers studying his technique. The rescue had felt like genuine moral choice, not psychological conditioning responding to experimental stimuli. The white feather in his breast pocket suddenly felt heavy with different significance. Had his calling card been part of the experiment too? A psychological marker designed to reinforce certain behavioral patterns while researchers observed how snipers constructed identity around symbolic gestures. He thought about his grandmother's letters, describing her concerns about Pavel's draft assignment and Katya's work with casualties. Were their experiences also part of systematic studies about family stress and combat effectiveness? How much of what felt personal and authentic was actually data being collected by institutions that viewed individual choices as variables in larger equations? That night, White Feather sat in the factory ruins where he had saved 8 lives, looking through calm breath scope at the same terrain where communication cables had connected enemy positions like a web of coordination. The tungsten rounds had severed those connections, but now he wondered what connections in his own thinking had been manipulated by unseen observers. Dr. Marchenko found him there an hour before dawn, carrying coffee and what looked like genuine remorse. "You weren't supposed to see those notes," she said quietly. "But perhaps it's better that you did." "Were any of my choices actually mine?" he asked, not lowering the rifle. "The choice to save those men was entirely yours," she replied. "We provided tools and observed outcomes, but we couldn't predict or control what you would do when the moment came. That's what made the experiment valuable, and what makes you extraordinary." White Feather considered her words while remembering his grandmother's voice, teaching him that even when following recipes, the baker's hands made the difference between nourishment and mere calories. Perhaps authentic choice existed in how techniques were applied, not in the techniques themselves. 6 months later, White Feather cleaned calm breath for the final time in his military career. The experimental tungsten rounds had become standard issue for sniper units, and communication disruption had entered official tactical doctrine as the Volkov Protocol. but the weight of being unknowingly observed had made continuing service impossible. The 8 rescued scouts had each received commendations, though the classified nature of the operation meant their families never learned the specific circumstances of their survival. Sergeant Petrov had sent a final message through unofficial channels. His daughter was now 12, still baking bread using great-grandmother's recipe, still believing her father was simply a supply clerk who occasionally traveled for work. Dr. Marchenko's psychological study had been classified at levels White Feather would never be authorized to read, but its practical applications were already visible across the military. New training protocols emphasized adaptive thinking alongside traditional marksmanship, and experimental ammunition continued expanding beyond tungsten penetrators to include various non-lethal options. Victor had requested transfer to a different unit, uncomfortable with the possibility that their partnership itself might be under observation. "I never know anymore whether my decisions are mine or responses to stimuli I can't identify," he had explained during their farewell conversation. The question haunted Whitefeather as he prepared for civilian life in a small town near Rostov, where his grandmother still baked bread using techniques passed down through generations of women who had lived through various wars. He had saved 8 lives by thinking beyond established doctrine, but learning that his innovation had been anticipated and studied made the achievement feel hollow. Yet in quiet moments, he remembered Petrov's voice breaking when he thought he would never see his daughter again, and the sound of relief when escape became possible. That emotional reality couldn't be reduced to psychological data or tactical protocols, regardless of how extensively it had been observed and analyzed. Whitefeather returned to his grandmother's kitchen in late spring 2015, bringing stories he couldn't tell and experiences he couldn't fully explain. She welcomed him with fresh bread and patient questions that never pushed beyond what he was ready to share. "You look like someone who learned something important," she said, while kneading dough with the steady rhythm he had learned to apply to marksmanship. Important lessons often come disguised as other things. He helped her bake that afternoon, feeling his hands remember techniques that predated military training and psychological experiments. The bread rose according to principles that couldn't be manipulated by external observers. Flour, water, yeast, and time, creating nourishment through processes that remained authentic regardless of who might be watching. Years later, when former soldiers gathered to share stories that couldn't be officially recorded, Whitefeather would sometimes mention the tungsten rounds and communication disruption tactics that had saved 8 lives in the industrial ruins outside Donetsk. He never mentioned the psychological experiments or the classified research that had transformed his decisions into institutional doctrine. What mattered most, he learned, wasn't whether his choices had been observed or anticipated, but that in the crucial moment he had chosen to save rather than kill. The white feather he kept in his desk drawer served as a reminder not of the fear it had once inspired in enemies, but of the calm breath his grandmother had taught him, steady rhythm that could guide difficult decisions regardless of external pressures. The tungsten ammunition he had initially dismissed as unnecessary complexity had become the key to saving 8 families from notification visits that winter. But the true innovation hadn't been technological. It had been remembering that even in warfare, especially in warfare, the point was preserving life rather than simply ending it. If this story reminded you that even in the darkest times, small acts of humanity still matter, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story. How do we distinguish authentic choice from conditioned response when the stakes are life and death?